There's another kind of diversity that I do want to get into um, because it's extremely important not only in classifying prokaryotes, but in understanding their ecological roles. And it has to do with the way that they get matter and energy that they need to build more of themselves. Just a refresher, you may remember this or you may not, based on how recently you've taken a biology course that talked about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. But essentially, the gain of energy in respiration always involves taking a chemical compound with high potential energy and stripping electrons away from it. What's shown here is an electron transport chain. Electrons are stripped away from this high potential energy compound up here. They're passed to some chemical compound that has slightly lower potential energy. It passes those electrons on and so on until you reach some electron acceptor way down here at the bottom that has much less potential energy. As the potential energy is released during this process, it ends up being stored in ATP, which can then be used to keep a cell running. However, there are a lot of different ways of doing this. This is one of the things that organisms need in order to survive, is they need some kind of energy. They need some process that takes those high energy compounds and strips the electrons away, gives them to some electron acceptor, and harvests that energy that can be then turned into ATP and used. So that's one thing that organisms use, but another thing they need is carbon. Almost all of the interesting molecules that you'll find inside any organism are carbon-based. It's such a versatile element that it forms the backbone of practically everything that's useful in your body. So in order to survive, organisms need these two things, energy and carbon. The bacteria and archaea show an amazing metabolic diversity. That is, they get their energy in a lot of different ways, and they get their carbon from a lot of different sources. This is part of what makes them so important ecologically. As far as ATP production goes, there are three general ways of getting energy. Phototrophs are organisms that can use light energy. Photo means light, and troph means to eat or to feed. So these are the organisms that eat light. Organotrophs eat organic molecules. That is, they take high energy organic molecules and they oxidize them. They strip electrons away from them, donate them to some lower energy compound, some electron acceptor, and in that process they get energy out that can be put into ATP. And then there are organisms called lithotrophs. Litho means stone. And these are organisms that take high energy compounds, strip electrons away, give them to low energy compounds. But the source of that energy, that high energy compound, is not an organic compound. It's an inorganic compound that arose somewhere other than a living organism. As far as carbon sources, there are a few different ways of getting carbon as well. Autotrophs are what we call self-feeders. Auto means self, again, troph means to eat. And these are organisms that can manufacture their own carbon-containing compounds. Whereas heterotrophs, other eaters, live by consuming carbon-containing compounds that were made by other organisms. Those can be bacteria, those can be archaea, those can be plants, animals, fungi. Something else stored up those carbon-containing compounds, and heterotrophs live by taking those carbon compounds away from those organisms. These heterotrophs can be quite harmful. Autotrophs tend to be photosynthetic organisms. They're nice and benign. They're taking carbon from things that are not living. But if you are a heterotroph, you live by taking carbon compounds away from something that either was living or still is. In the latter case, you generally are a parasite or a pathogen or a predator. And we'll be hearing all about those later on as we go through the rest of this course. But when you're talking about bacteria, what you're largely talking about here are, if they're not scavenging organic molecules out of the environment, they are pathogens. So this table sums up the different strategies that bacteria and archaea can have for gaining energy and carbon. Autotrophs make their own carbon-containing compounds. Heterotrophs take their carbon-containing compounds from others. Photoautotrophs use light to make their own carbon compounds, and these should be pretty familiar to you because this is basically photosynthesis as you know it. Bacteria that undergo photosynthesis are called cyanobacteria. These are fairly chemically familiar to you if you've taken a lot of biology. They use the Calvin cycle to fix CO2, and that should be something that you've heard of before. There are some organisms that are autotrophic, but they use organic molecules with high potential energy as the source of energy, and that's kind of strange. Clostridium is a bacterium that you may have heard of that does this, but these are unusual enough that there's even no term for this group. Finally, down here, there are chemolithotrophs, organisms that get energy from inorganic molecules, but make their own carbon-containing molecules. They also use the carbon cycle. They fix CO2 using the Calvin cycle. They use the Calvin cycle to fix CO2, but the energy doesn't come from the sun. They, for example, nitrifying bacteria use ammonia as an electron donor. And so they take ammonia and convert it into other kinds of nitrogen-containing compounds. From that, they get the energy to make CO2 into chemical compounds that they can use to build themselves. Over on the other side here, you have some very unusual strategies. Photoheterotrophs get organic compounds from other organisms, but they use light energy to construct them to construct ATP. So they're benign in the sense that they're using light rather than getting energy from other organisms, but they do have to pick up those organic molecules from some other organism that built them in the first place. Chemoorganotrophs take carbon molecules with high potential energy, and that's their source of energy for making ATP. That's also, they use organic compounds from their environment to get carbon. E. coli may be the most common bacterium in your body. It's a bacterium that lives in your digestive tract and is usually benign, although certain strains of it can make you sick or even kill you. And down here, finally, the chemolithotrophic heterotrophs, say that 3 times fast, use organic compounds from the environment as a carbon source, but use inorganic molecules with high potential energy as a source of ATP. And again, this is one of these organisms that uses an inorganic compound and converts it into a different chemical form. As we'll hear about later, that's very important in nutrient cycles. That's probably a pretty confusing way of classifying organisms, but it should give you at least a rudimentary handle on the different strategies that these prokaryotic organisms have for getting the energy and matter that they need. Another way of looking at metabolic diversity of the Bacteria and Archaea is to look at them in terms of their basic metabolic mechanisms. As I talked about earlier, electron transport chains pass electrons down a whole chain of intermediates that are lower and lower in potential energy until you reach a final electron acceptor. If an organism uses this kind of mechanism, to get energy out of high energy compounds and generate ATP. This is called cellular respiration. However, cellular respiration, as you know it, is only one way of accomplishing this process. As you might imagine, the bacteria and archaea use a lot of different electron donors up at this end and a lot of different electron acceptors down at this end. Really, in order to use this process, all you really have to have is this chain of intermediates that connect some high energy electron donor up here and any old low energy electron acceptor down there. So for example, not only are there electron donors like sugar and organic compounds, which are the ones that you probably think of, especially sugar because that's what your body uses as fuel in cellular respiration, but there are organisms that use methane as an energy source. There are organisms that use atmospheric nitrogen and other forms of nitrogen-containing compounds, nitrate and ammonia. They strip electrons away from those and pass them down an electron transport chain. Similarly, the compound down here at the bottom can be quite different. Oxygen is an especially good electron acceptor. Oxygen really likes electrons, and so when electrons are with oxygen, that's a state where they have very low potential energy. So oxygen is capable of accepting electrons from a huge variety of donors. However, if you haven't got access to oxygen, and some organisms don't, you can use things like carbon dioxide or certain iron ions in its place. Or if you don't want to do any of that, you can eschew cellular respiration entirely and use fermentation instead. Fermentation generates ATP, but it does not use an electron transport chain. What you've got instead is a high energy compound, generally glucose, for example, being broken down and yielding a few ATP in the process. And then that intermediate, whatever it is, accepts the electrons that were generated by NADH here, or whatever electron carrier you've got here. That recycles this electron carrier so that it can accept electrons from the breakdown of this fuel once more. And so you can keep on generating ATP as long as you can regenerate this electron carrier. This doesn't yield a lot of ATP. It just sort of kicks out this intermediate product that has not been fully broken down. However, it's good enough to get by with if that's what you've got. Your body uses it, for example, when you haven't got oxygen to serve as an electron acceptor. In your body, glucose is broken down into pyruvate. Pyruvate accepts electrons from NADH and becomes lactate. This is the lactic acid fermentation. It's why your muscles hurt so much after you have a tough workout. Fermentation isn't just when you're feeling the burn in the gym, not the political sense this season. It's also very useful for making various different kinds of food. Without fermentation, we would not have yogurt, we would not have beer, and other types of products that we rely on a great deal. Yogurt in particular is a fermentation product that is generated by prokaryotic bacteria. Because archaea and bacteria use a tremendous number of electron donors and electron acceptors in their metabolism, they play key parts in the cycling of a lot of nutrients. So for example, we've already heard about nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which play a key role in the nitrogen cycle in terrestrial ecosystems. The nitrogen compounds that are generated by those bacteria also can get interconverted among different forms, say ammonia, nitrite, nitrate, and can be made into organic compounds that have amino groups, like say, amino acids, or something like that. To complete the cycle, there are some bacteria and archaea that can take nitrate and use it in their metabolism, generating molecular nitrogen again. These prokaryotic metabolizers also play very important roles in other nutrient cycles, including the carbon cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the sulfur cycle. Generally, if you're looking for an organism that can use its metabolism to shift the form of some compound that's important in life, it's going to be some kind of archaea or some bacteria that does it out in nature. Third, but certainly not least, a number of prokaryotes can use photosynthesis. And not just the photosynthesis that you're familiar with. Chlorophyll A intercepts particular wavelengths of light, but there are a lot of different chlorophylls and other energy capturing molecules that are capture other wavelengths of light best. So for example, the cyanobacteria, which are most closely aligned with the chlorophyll that you know and love, capture wavelength best in these wavelengths of light here. But the photosynthetic proteobacteria capture light that falls in entirely different wavelengths. And this is good because you can have these two organisms living in the same place, perhaps even shading one another out, and they can still make a living because they use complementary resources. There are many other chlorophylls that you see listed up here that can be used to capture even more wavelengths of light.